Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Brian's Horror Corner, and welcome to this day 7 horror movie review as part of my 31 Days of Halloween Horror series for the month of October here. So, today we're going to go ahead and jump into the world of horror anthology. You're probably wondering what took me so long, because if you know me, you know that horror anthologies are one of my favorite subgenres of horror. So, you knew we weren't going to get far into this series without taking a look at one. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at one from Amicus. I've seen a few of these Amicus horror anthology movies, but I haven't seen this one. It's a first time watch for me. And that's from 1971, which is The House That Dripped Blood. As you can see with that great cover there. Unfortunately, the cover doesn't really give much way into what the movie's going to be about necessarily. Neither does the title, but we'll get into it. So, um, yeah, let's just go ahead and get started. So, The House That Dripped Blood is a 1971 British anthology horror film directed by Peter Duffel, and distributed by Amicus Productions. The film is a collection of four short stories concerning a series of inhabitants in a eponymous building, basically a mansion or a rental house. All of these stories were originally written and subsequently scripted by Robert Bloch. So that's notable because Robert Bloch, of course, wrote the screenplay, the book, or the novel, I should say, for Psycho. So, yeah. So basically, the film opens shortly after renting an old country house. Film star Paul Henderson mysteriously disappears, and Inspector Holloway from Scotland Yard is called to investigate. Inquiring at the local police station, Holloway is told some of the house's history. So basically, you have this inspector that comes to the police station who's looking for this missing film star, and that's kind of how the stories are introduced. Either the police chief, or I'm assuming like the police chief, and then also like the real estate agent kind of tell the history of the house and these different that's how they introduce these different stories, the different inhabitants of the house. So um I'm just going to give you some of the cast. I'm not going to give you all of it because with four segments and a wraparound story, there's just too many to list here. But most notably from Method for Murder, which is the first segment, that's the name of the first segment, you have Denholm Elliott as Charles Hillier. From Waxworks, you have Peter Cushing as Philip Grayson. That's the name. Waxworks, the name of that segment. Sweets to the Sweet, the name of the third segment, has Christopher Lee as John Reed. And the final segment, The Cloak, has John Pertwee, Pertwee as Paul Henderson, and Ingrid Pitt as Carla Lind. There's a lot more actors and actresses in this anthology in this movie, but I can't list them all as I've said. So yeah, kind of talking a little bit about the what the individual stories are about. First of all, as I said, the wraparound story is this inspector from Scotland Yard that's investigating this missing film star, inquiring at the local police station. So that's kind of our framing story. Method for Murder is the name of the first story. This is the one with Denholm Elliott, who plays Charles Hillier. He's basically a hack writer who specializes in writing horror stories. And his wife Alice, they move into this house. Charles begins working on a novel focusing on Dominic, a murderous psychopathic strangler. And then Charles becomes simultaneously enamored and disturbed by the character. He starts seeing this character pop up in real life, and um, this person Dominic from his stories, who begins stalking and tormenting him basically, and then um, the short kind of the story goes on from there, and I think most notable about this one is it has some creepy images, but it also has kind of a double twist at the end of this story, which it works for the most part. Denholm Elliott is great in it. So yeah, that's that one. The second one, entitled Waxworks. This is the one with Peter Cushing as Philip Grayson. Retired stockbroker Philip Grayson moves into the house. Though initially he occupies himself with his hobbies, he occupies his time, I should say, with his hobbies. He quickly becomes lonely. One day, while wandering around town, he happens upon a wax museum. Grayson explores the museum and finds a sculpture of Salome, which resembles a dead woman he was once in love with. The museum's proprietor explains that he based the likeness of the sculpture on his late wife, who had been executed after murdering his best friend. Disturbed, Grayson vows never to return. So this one's a little bit kind of all over the place, but it's also really creepy. It has some great practical effects, some great Peter Cushing, of course. So this one's kind of a complicated story in terms of my like for it, but we'll get more into that when I get into my pros and cons. The next story, Sweets to the Sweet. This is the one with Christopher Lee, who plays widower John Reed, who moves into the house along with his pyrophobic young daughter, Jane. John hires a former teacher, Anne Norton, to tutor Jane. Anne gradually bonds with Jane, and she helps Jane get over her fear of fire and teaches her how to read, but begins to suspect that John is abusive. He does not allow her to play with other children or own toys, and does his best to keep her isolated. This is probably the best paced story, and of course you have Christopher Lee, who's just as always is brilliant in this story. Um, yeah, this is a really interesting story. I'll get more into it again with my pros and cons. The fourth and final story is entitled "The Cloak." Temperamental veteran horror film actor Paul Henderson moves into the house while starring in a vampire film being shot nearby. Henderson, a great fan of horror genre, is angry over the lack of realism in the film, particularly over the cloak worn by his character, which is a vampire. He decides to purchase a more accurate cloak, and to that end stops at an antique shop run by the enigmatic, enigmatic. I don't know what the hell. I can't pronounce that word. It's fucking Friday night. So Theo Van Hartman. Van Hartman offers him a black cloak after listening to Henderson's demands, and Henderson purchases it. Before he leaves, Von Hartman tells him to use the cloak for its intended purpose. And so then that one kind of goes from there. This one has the most comedy, I would say. It's kind of I don't know if lighter is the right tone. It still has some horror in it, but it definitely has a comedic element to it. Um, and this is the one with John Pertwee and and then the actress Ingrid Pitt as Carla in this one. Um, and this one ties the most into the wraparound story, the ending of the movie overall. So yeah, that's the setup, the premise, and the cast. I know it's kind of I was kind of all over the place. Describing some of these anthologies are hard because normally I go in a certain order with premise to cast, and kind of telling you what the movie's about. But when you have four separate stories and a framing wraparound story, and then you have cast within each story, it's just kind of all over the place. But um, yeah, that's the house that dripped blood to set up the premise and the cast and these individual stories. Um, as somebody who's a fan of the Amicus horror anthology movies, I've seen three other ones. I saw Asylum, From Beyond the Grave, and Doctor Terror's House of Horror. This one kind of falls in the middle for me. Um, it's not my favorite, but it's certainly not horrible either. So let's just go ahead and get into it, starting with the things I liked about the movie or the pros. I have to say, all the stories were pretty good. There were no real duds here. They all have interesting premises, and more importantly, they all have fun little twists in the end of all of them that work pretty well for the most part. There wasn't one that felt cheap. So that's definitely one of the best things about this anthology. That the four stories, the four shorts, are all pretty solid. None of them are overly great, but none of them are terrible. They all have their pros to them. Um, as I said, in the case of the first one with Denholm Elliott, you got the little bit of a double twist there, as well as some creepy visuals and imagery as well. In the second story with Peter Cushing, Waxworks, you have a great performance by Peter Cushing. You have some great horror imagery. You have wax figures, which is always creepy to begin with. The third story with Sweets to the Sweet with Christopher Lee. This is the best paced story. I think this is the best unfolding story, if that makes sense. It's not quite as hard to sort of peg how it was going to turn out, and it kind of has the best characters in it too, I would say. And then the final one, The Cloak, like I said, has the most humor in it. It has good performances by John Pertwee and Ingrid Pitt, and it ties into the wraparound story. So yeah, they all have their positives for sure. For sure. The other big thing about this anthology, of course, is the performances across the board are second to none. Second to none. They're really solid, especially Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Denholm Elliott, and Ingrid Pitt, just to name a few. But you could really, I could have listed all of them. I thought everybody was great, but those four really stood out to me the most. Also, I should mention the little girl in the third, Sweets to the Sweet with Christopher Lee. I forget the actress's name. I didn't write it down, but the little girl, I think she's about 7 or 8 in that story is really good as well and really helps sell that particular segment. But yeah, the performances, as in most of these Amicus anthologies, is phenomenal. Also, I have to say there's some really good creepy music, especially in the opening credits, um, and at different points throughout the movie that really works well. It fits well into this movie with those certain Amicus theme musical scores. So I wanted to mention that there's some pretty good creepy visuals and moments, especially in the second and the fourth segments. I would say you could say the first one too, but Method for Murder, but especially Waxworks and the Cloak. I would say the Cloak probably more so actually as it ties into the wraparound at the very end. Um, the movie has some really good practical and makeup effects, especially for the time that it was made. Nothing looks overly silly or bad. They did a good job with only doing the effects and using the effects that they could pull off. The makeup effects as well are really good here. Um, really enjoyed the ending with the inspector returning to the house with what he is confronting in that finale and the tie-in with the final story and in terms of who the inspector is looking for, that really worked well for me. I really love the settings in this movie. The wax museum, for one, has to be brought up because, as I said before, there's just something creepy about wax figures. But then the house overall, I'm a big fan of haunted houses, of mansions, of older settings like that with those large houses, and it certainly plays well in this movie with all the different rooms. It really adds to the fun atmosphere of this movie. So I have to bring that up. Is in terms of the individual segments, like my favorites, it's kind of tough because, and this is why that this anthology doesn't rank higher for me compared to some of the other ones. Is they're all good. None of them are great. None of them are horrible. They all have their good things and they all have their problems. Um, but I'm going to say Waxworks is my favorite personally for me because of the wax figures, because of the ending little fight scene and horror that goes on with it, and because of Peter Cushing. Those three things right there are enough for me to have this be my favorite. The problem is this one's kind of all over the place and it's not paced as well as some of the other ones. I would say my second favorite, Sweets to the Sweet, which is definitely the best paced one, probably has the three best performers overall with Christopher Lee, the woman that comes in and plays the teacher, the nanny, and then, as I said, the young girl. They're really solid. The story, kind of how it unfolds from beginning to end, is really solid. Like I said, it's the best paced one. It's just not really that horrific to me. That's sort of the negative of that one. Then third, I would say, would be the Cloak, which this one's great because it ties into the wraparound story. It's what the inspectors, it's why he's there. It's kind of what he's looking for. What happened to this actor? And this has some great visual imagery. It has some great horror imagery. The look of the vampire in this at the very end of the movie, that's actually outside of this particular segment, is really solid. Um, but the humor really didn't work for me. There's one line that worked for me, and that was sort of a fourth wall breaking line where the actor John Pertwee, who's playing Paul Henderson, mentions when he's going off about vampires and Dracula, his favorite interpretation, of course, being Bela Lugosi, not that newer fella, which is really funny because that newer fella, of course, at the time that this was made was Christopher Lee, which was in the previous segment. So there was a nice tie-in joke there. But other than that, the other humor, the lightness of it really didn't work all that well for me. So that's the negative there. And then finally, the method for murder would be my fourth. And I hate to say least favorite because I still enjoyed this segment with Denholm Elliott's performance and some of the visuals and the double twist at the end, which worked for me pretty well. But I don't know. It doesn't take it to that upper level like Asylum does with some of its shorts. So yeah, that's my pros, I guess. I guess I get into a little bit of cons with there too. The biggest con, getting into the overall cons, the title's the biggest con. The House That Dripped Blood. I don't think I saw blood anywhere in this movie. It's a very misleading title. Someone that doesn't know much about the Amicus films might go into this movie with just the title, not being aware, and could really be let down by this movie and expecting one thing and getting another. And well, it's still a really solid horror anthology. Yeah, to have a title, The House That Dripped Blood, they should have just had The House of Horror or something. I know they already had Dr. Terror's House of Horror, so they really couldn't do that. But yeah, not a very good title for this. That's definitely a con. And then my other biggest con with this movie is I just didn't feel like the wraparound or the framing story was all that memorable or all that great, to be honest with you. It certainly wasn't as strong as Asylum. I didn't think it was as strong as From Beyond the Grave either, of the ones that I've seen. I was kind of expecting and wanting a little bit more, and it's just kind of there. Like the inspector, the guy who plays the inspector is fine, but there's really no they're just a way to introduce the stories, and it does tie in at the end, but there's no real creativity or excitement associated with the wraparound story, in my opinion. I'm not really crazy either about the fourth wall breaking at the very end, where the real estate agent basically turns to the audience and talks to the viewers directly through exposition as to what the secret of the house is. I think we kind of know by this point. At least I did. Hopefully, people do. Again, it's another exposition dump that's not needed. It's kind of cheesy, and I don't know. I didn't need it. It didn't work for me. Maybe it works for some other people. As I said, some of the segments aren't as well paced as others. Um, Mainly Waxworks. That was the biggest problem with that one. And the Cloak as well, I'm going to say, isn't all that well paced, but Sweets to the Sweet is, and um, Method for Murder is okay pace. So the overall pacing just isn't as strong as some of the other Asylum or Asylum. You can see where I'm going with this. Some of the Amicus horror anthologies. So yeah, I know it sounds like I'm ripping this movie. I'm really not. I did enjoy this. I'm definitely glad I have it in my collection. It is a really solid Amicus horror anthology. It's just not as solid as two others for sure that I've watched. That being that being Asylum and um, From Beyond the Grave, and I think the wraparound has a lot to do with it. That and the fact that none of the stories, none of the individual segments really take it above and beyond like Asylum did, like From Beyond the Grave did, at least in my opinion. They're all just sort of good, none of them being great, and all of them sort of having some issues. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give this, and maybe I'm being too harsh, but I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 overall. I think it was fine. I think it's a good Amicus horror anthology movie, just not a great one. So that's my opinion. 7 out of 10 for The House That Dripped Blood. I hate that title again. Um, Go ahead and comment down below what you guys think of The House That Dripped Blood from 1971, the Amicus horror anthology. Did you like it more than I did, less than I did? Why not? Comment down below. Please be sure to like this video and hit the little notification bell down below so you don't miss any of my upcoming movie reviews for this 31 Days of Halloween horror series. And please be sure to subscribe to my channel down below as well so that you don't miss any of my great horror content. Not just this series for the rest of the month, but what I have coming up beyond for the rest of the year and into next year. So I apologize for the length of this review. Horror anthologies are hard. I haven't quite pegged them down how to make them more efficient reviews yet, but thank you for watching. Hope your October is going well, and thank you for watching this Day 7 horror movie review as part of my 31 Days of Halloween horror series. Stay scared. Bye.